that Jews can fit into the modern world, that there's no reason that Jews should be treated any differently. And so you have the kind of beginnings of this intense period of surveying Jewish life. In France, you have a movement, the Alliance Israélite Universelle, in the and that starts in 1860. In the United States, in the Reform Movement, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, as early as 1875, starts like its French counterpart to survey the Jewish population, figure out where Jews are, what they're doing, the professions they're involved in, all in an attempt to create this kind of community portrait that is going to prove that Jews are modern, right? That they need not be treated as if they're clannish or primitive or somehow not for the enlightened modern world. Germany also has various bureaus devoted to the same project. So what emerges by the early 20th century, that many agencies throughout the Jewish world are invested in counting Jews and creating kind of ethnographic portraits of Jews, because you don't just have surveys being done, you also have different researchers going to communities and interviewing people and talking to people and trying to really capture the voices of Jews in different communities. And so you have all of these new portraits of Jewish life being produced at this time. Almost all of the work that's being done by the beginning of the 20th century falls, however, into a kind of ideological battle in a certain sense. And you have some of the portraits being produced by people who are very Zionist in their thinking about Jewish life in the diaspora, who are creating these demographic portraits of Jewish life to prove, in a sense, that Jews cannot thrive or survive in the diaspora. So you have studies of different Jewish communities that are not reproducing themselves, right? There are very low fertility rates. You have studies showing the persistence of anti-Semitism. You have some of these researchers really making the statement through their research that the bottom line is that Jewish life is not going to survive in a diasporic context, and this is an argument for Zionism. So you have all this very Zionist kind of demographic, social scientific material being produced. On the other hand, really at the same time, you have some very assimilationist social scientists using some of the very same data to make the absolutely different case, that Jews are actually starting to intermarry with other populations and that there's nothing abnormal or unnatural about this. This is the proper chain of events for a modern assimilated people. People showing Jewish economic success in the diaspora, even studies showing how Jews' bodies change as they're becoming more and more assimilated into diaspora society, right? So a very assimilationist kind of ideology. And one could explore a lot more about the kind of ideological imperatives of this kind of social scientific data, the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. But what I would say is that demographic data in the Jewish community continues to have a very deeply ideological angle to it, right? That it does not shed its ideology throughout the 20th century in the least. So let's talk a little bit then about the kind of ideologies, especially after they develop after World War II. So after World War II, Jews in the United States sort of realized, whether they like it or not, they're kind of the bookkeepers now of world Jewry, right? I mean, the centers in Europe that had been so invested in the social scientific survey project no longer exist, and American Jews sort of inherit this task. They're very self-conscious in talking about the inheritance of that task. And they realize also that counting Jews now has its sort of different significance because there are so many fewer Jews to be counted, right? There are less Jews to be counted. They maintain, Jewish intellectuals after World War II, on the whole, maintain a kind of faith in empiricism, a faith in counting, a faith in the kind of rational project of quantifying the Jewish population. That somehow by counting it, this in and of itself is a way of waging the battle against what Hitler was trying to do and ultimately becoming victorious in that battle. And there's a massive outpouring of sociological and demographic studies after World War II. Mainly, these studies are sponsored by Jewish agencies, the American Jewish Committee, which started in the United States at the beginning of the 20th century, it is mainly a kind of, it has German Jewish sort of elite roots, becomes very involved in this project of the demography, social scientific study of Jews. And a number of actually intellectual Jewish refugees become the kind of thinkers at these Jewish agencies who are producing the social scientific studies and the data. You also have the fact, I think, fueling this movement of Jews toward a real obsession with counting and studying themselves, the fact that more and more Jews, of course, are let into universities and are getting the academic training to enter the social scientific disciplines where this kind of work is being done. So in effect, Jews are gaining more and more of the professional credentials to be involved in this sort of business. You have an outpouring of journals and conferences and books, all devoted to studying the social scientific, the surveys, the demographics of Jewish life after the war. And this coincides also with a trend in American life more generally to be sort of fixated with polling data, with finding the norm, finding the average, Gallup polls, the Kinsey reports after World War II, the sort of idea that through these kinds of surveys of the normal, one can locate oneself and in a certain sense make oneself that norm, right? So this is in line with these trends that are quite strong in the United States after World War II. But the purpose, I think, of these post-war surveys of Jewish life is to create an ideology of Jewish Americanness. And I think you can see this really quite clearly. Much of the way that the demographics of Jews is sort of packaged, it clearly is about fitting Jews into American trends and into American patterns, a sort of self-conscious desire to prove to themselves and to other Americans that Jews experience things like everyone else, right? This desire to assert a kind of Americanness. There's also a major component of the kind of defense agency work that I spoke about arising in the 19th century. And these efforts to fight prejudice that are encoded in these demographic efforts, educating Americans about who Jews are, what Jews do, what they look like, how they pray, trying to prove that Jews are normal, that they shouldn't be discriminated against, and that discrimination in and of itself is un-American, right? So again, these kinds of portraits of community being less about that community per se and more about how the community fits into a larger national identity. But there's also a way in which it's a construction of an American Jewish identity and pride in that identity, trying to assert a kind of new national ideology for the United States where diversity is embraced, right? Where Jews, by being Jews, somehow enhance what America is. And this theme clearly comes out in the kind of demographic work that Jews do after World War II. In coordinating a new round of major studies about Jewry, the American Jewish Committee said that these studies, and this is in I think it was the late 1940s, said that these studies would present Jews to the world with a right to dignity and to the respect of other cultures and civilizations, and secondly, give fiber and strength and vitality to the Jews. So it's an act both of national membership and also of reasserting and reconstructing community after World War II. The reality is that these studies, and you can really see this almost in a painful way after World War II, represent Jews trying to envision themselves into what they want to be and what America should be like after World War II, right? And this is, I mean, I'm talking mainly 40s, 50s, before the kind of Holocaust industry, which is a whole another place where Jews envision themselves. Before